I'm supposed to talk about the very small question of science, suffering, and hope. Should be a very short topic. I'm, of course, being silly. These are very big questions, big topics to cover. So I'm, of course, going to cover them in very little depth. So I will just note that, okay, well, there's three concepts here. There's science, suffering, and hope. The main thing we need to be thinking about is how these things interact with each other. Okay? What impact does science have on suffering? Is there some interaction between science and hope? Are hope and suffering related in some fashion or another? And so we're going to start off with the first of these, how are science and suffering related? And I'm going to start this off with an intentionally very provocative statement. And that statement is as follows. Science is the most powerful tool mankind has ever created for the reduction of human suffering. Now that's a pretty big statement. But I believe that it is true. Or if it's not true yet, it's very likely to be true in the near future. I mean, think about it. Science is responsible for medicines that cure innumerable diseases and prevent and protect us from infection. Science is responsible for increasing crop yields that have allowed billions of people to eat who would otherwise starve to death. Science allows us to fix significant environmental challenges like the hole in the ozone layer. Advances in mechanization and manufacturing have freed billions of people from tedious, dangerous working conditions. The almost limitless availability of electrical and chemical power has led to great increases in our quality of life. Our ability to build safe structures in which we can live protects us from the elements and dangerous predators. Science has made mind-bogglingly large contributions to the alleviation of human suffering. And so I feel pretty comfortable saying that science is the most powerful tool mankind has ever created for the reduction of human suffering. If it's not true today, wait 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, 100 years, and ask me then. So this tells us that there is a profound relationship between science and suffering. But this is only part of the story. Because I believe that that statement is true, and I also believe that this statement is true. Science is the most powerful tool mankind has ever created for the proliferation of human suffering. I could just take the same categories I threw up here. Science is responsible also for nearly every poison or toxin that you can think of. Some of these poisons were unintentional. Thalidomide was intended to be good, but turned out to be very harmful. Others, like nerve gas, were clearly intended to be harmful from the beginning. The same chemicals that are responsible for increasing crop yields are also toxic for humans if we ingest them in too high a dose. And lest we should give science too much credit for fixing the hole in the ozone layer, we should admit that science was the cause of the hole in the ozone layer to begin with. Mechanization has improved manufacturing. It has also improved warfare. The availability of near limitless power has led to the development of weapons of near limitless destruction. And the encroachment of human civilization, shelters like this one, has led to the most rapid extinction of species that the Earth has seen in at least 500 million years. So science is a double-edged sword here. And the fundamental problem here is that science itself is neither inherently good nor inherently evil. Science is morally neutral. The defining characteristic of science as it regards suffering is not its goodness or its badness, but its power. Science, depending on who wields it and how they choose to use it, science can either be a great, great force for good or a great, great force for ill. And in this way, science is like money or fame or reason or intelligence. They are all forms of power, and all those forms of power can be used for good or for bad. And so in order to make science a force for good rather than bad, we need something more than just science itself, something that decides if a given topic is a good topic for science to work on or a bad one. This is what I would call a moral framework. We might derive this from a religion or a philosophy or from history, but we need shared moral standards as a society if we want to ensure that science does more good than harm. Now, there are some criteria that such a moral framework is going to need to satisfy. So first, where did I go? Oh, here we go. That moral framework needs to be consistent with the practice of science. I need to know that my ethical standards support the basic principles of scientific study. So, observation, experimentation, reasoning. If someone proposes to work on something that seems likely to harm large numbers of people, well, yes, I want my ethics to tell them, no, you can't do that. But I want our ethical system to judge that based on the potential implications of the scientific study. We don't want our moral system to reject science because we think it is wrong to observe or reason. Now, there are many principles that could cause our moral framework to be fundamentally anti-science. We could have a fear of what science might ultimately discover. We could be suspicious of the ethical standards of scientists themselves, or we could have some tightly, rigidly held beliefs that appear to contradict existing evidence. And indeed, historically, there have been any number of political, social, and religious groups that have been anti-science. But if we reject particular areas simply because we don't like the way science is done, we're just as likely to be rejecting things that are good as things that are bad. And so if we're interested in reducing human suffering, our moral framework can't be fundamentally anti-science. It has to be consistent with scientific practice. But in addition to this, our framework needs to be powerful enough to direct scientific inquiry. You see, as we've already discussed, science is very powerful. And if our ethical system is not at least as powerful as science itself, it will be incapable of dictating which scientific questions are good and which ones we should avoid. To put it another way, if science is a gorilla and our ethical code is a kitten, we can hardly expect our ethics to be effective at keeping science from causing suffering. And I think this is a significant problem because with the rise of technical education, the success of places like MIT, many students are graduating with the technical training of a gorilla and the ethical training of a kitten. We're forgetting that the more we learn about science, the more important it is that we have a strong moral center. For example, suppose that I, as a chemist, were to discover a new drug and show that it is effective at treating breast cancer in mice. What is more, suppose that I find no significant side effects of the drug in mice. It kills the cancer and the mice live long, happy mouse lives for years and years afterwards. Now, I may suspect that there might be some problems with toxicity in humans, but the data on mice is all good. Am I then justified in proceeding to perform a clinical trial in humans? This is a thorny ethical question. And as I decide this, it's important for you to recognize that a successful drug for treating breast cancer would probably make me both very famous and very, very rich. That is the gorilla. Because unless my ethical framework is also very powerful and very tightly held, I will be tempted to go ahead with the trial, even if I have my suspicions that the drug may be toxic. And so in terms of relating science to suffering, we need something else. We need a moral framework that is both consistent with science and powerful enough to direct science. Now, coming up with a framework that satisfies both these constraints is very difficult. And so I'm not going to answer this challenge right now. We'll come back to it a little bit later, but I'm going to leave that tension hanging in the air for the moment. How can we do this? I'm going to move on now to the second leg of our triangle. We've talked some about how science interacts with suffering. Now let's talk about science and hope. And I want to start here by noting that there are many people who view the progress of science as a great source of hope for the future. For example, in the last century, there were a number of eminent thinkers who got together and drafted a document that they called a Humanist Manifesto. And it founded itself on, quote unquote, the scientific spirit and method. And it made some rather bold predictions. It predicted that following this spirit would lead to, among other things, world peace, social equality, and internal feelings of joy and fulfillment. And this manifesto was written in 1933. Now, 6 years later, World War II broke out. And the deadliest war in human history called into question some of the rosy predictions of this manifesto. And so in 1977, some scientists, some folks got together and they wrote Humanist Manifesto 2, one of the earliest sequels known to man. And in this, they got together to write this because, in their opinion, the first version was far too optimistic. So they tempered their claims in this manifesto. However, it was still based on science, and the overall tone was still hopeful. And then in 2003, another group of scientists got together and wrote Humanist Manifesto 3, The Empire Strikes Back. And in this one, the hope for the future was tempered still more, but it was still overall a tone of hope for the future. And the first major theme of the document was the following proposition, the proposition that knowledge of the world is derived by observation, reason, experimentation, and reason. Or the translation is, the premise was that science rules. So if we just follow science, things will turn out well. Now, that's one relationship between science and hope. More recently, social scientists have been taking a different tack for trying to derive, they've been trying to derive hope from science in a rather different way. Rather than making principled statements about how the scientific worldview can be the basis of hope, instead, they've been asking the reverse question. If we look at the data scientifically, do things appear to be getting better? Leaders in this area are folks like Steven Pinker and Max Rosser. And if you look at much of the data, the results appear to suggest that yes, things are getting better. The gender equality in the world is on the rise. Malnutrition rates have decreased steadily. The rates of violent crime are declining. The mortality rate from war is decreasing. As an example of this kind of study, here is a plot of the homicide rate in Western Europe as a function of time. So starting back in the 1300s and going up to the present day. And you see that this is a pretty good trend. I'll note that this is a log scale, so this is a pretty rapid, pretty significant decline. You look at data like this, and you could derive hope for the future. It's natural. And the authors of these studies attribute this positive trend largely to the advancement of science and scientific thinking. Now, I am tremendously uneasy about attributing these kinds of positive trends to science. Because as we discussed already, science is morally neutral. Any hope for the future that would come from this would have to come from pairing science with some sort of commonly held moral framework. And in fact, I would say it's actually worse than that, because science itself is actually very, very bad at generating hope. It's very, very good at undermining hope, because science advances by skepticism. We can actually illustrate this with the very data I've just presented. You see, arguments like this have been very controversial in literature, in part because the data from ancient times is really suspect. I mean, do we really know the homicide rate in Western Europe from 1300 to 1400 with any degree of certainty? It's not like they kept great data. So that's one of the things that causes you to undermine this hypothesis a bit. The second thing is that it's not clear whether this is a trend or a fluctuation. When I draw it this way, it sure looks like a trend, but I intentionally have not shown you all the data. This data only goes up through 1980. If I include the data up through 2000, it looks like that. And if I extrapolate to what things are looking like for 2020, it's going further up, not further down. And so for something like this, you have to say, well, under what circumstances do I call it a trend, and under what circumstances is it a dip? And so, even when science appears to provide hope with one hand, with the other hand, it undermines that same hope, because science is inherently skeptical. Now, that lack of hope can actually be a fairly strong driver for scientific study. So I had a friend when I was an undergraduate who was an atheist and a biologist. And I asked him why he decided to study biology. And he answered my question with a question of his own. He said, suppose that we were both on a spaceship, and the oxygen tank on the spaceship sprung a leak so that we only had 1 hour left to live. How would you spend your hour? And I told him I wasn't sure. He said, well, I know exactly how I would spend my hour. I would spend my hour fixing that oxygen tank. He became a biologist because as an atheist, he said, well, we've only got a finite amount of time on this earth. My job is to make that time as long as possible for as many people as possible. And he saw biology as a way to do that. And this is common, I think. People whose worldview has a limited capacity for hope are often drawn to science. But ironically, this is a bit like people who are thirsty moving to a desert. Because whatever hope we might have, science is very adept at calling that hope into question. Because hope concerns things about which we have incomplete evidence. For example, it would make no sense for me to say that I hope I put pants on this morning. Evidently, I put pants on this morning. It would also make no sense for me to say that I hope I won the Nobel Prize last year. Evidently, I did not win the Nobel Prize last year. Hope about things that are provably true is not hope. That is logic. Hope about things that are demonstrably false is also not hope. That is delusion. Hope exists in that middle ground where we have incomplete evidence. And when we have incomplete evidence, science is always going to be able to poke holes in hope. And so you might say, fine, I really like science, but I'll just do without hope. But that doesn't really solve the problem, because if you don't have hope, you're going to have to replace it with something else, like despair or fatalism. You see, hope is a conviction. It's a conviction that something good is going to happen. And science pokes holes in that by saying, well, how are you so sure that something good is going to happen? Despair is also a conviction. It's the conviction that something good is not going to happen, to which science can poke holes and say, well, how do you know something good is not going to happen? Fatalism is the attitude that it doesn't matter what we do, the same thing is going to happen anyway, to which science can say, well, how can you be sure that what you do doesn't matter? We need these kinds of attitudes, hope, despair, and fatalism, and they're each a kind of certainty, or a kind of sureness, a kind of confidence in the face of incomplete evidence. And we need these attitudes in order to make decisions about the future, because when I make a decision about the future, like whether to start a clinical drug trial or who to vote for an election, if I'm making a decision about the future, my information is always incomplete because the future has not happened yet. And in this situation, these kinds of attitudes, these kinds of certainties play a crucial role. Let me illustrate this with an example, another made-up story from me. So suppose we have a friend, Sally, and Sally went out hiking and she got lost. She's been lost now for several days. She ate all her food several days ago and she's beginning to starve, and she can't find her way back to base camp. But luckily, as she's hiking over this mountain pass, she looks across a deep valley and she notices a delicious plate of bacon. And while science and faith is not an either-or proposition, bacon is definitely either-or. Either you like bacon or you are wrong. So Sally is really hungry and she really wants the bacon. Unfortunately, the valley is too wide for her to jump across and too steep for her to hike down. Luckily, as you can see, she spots a bridge. But unfortunately, it's a pretty shaky-looking bridge. It's missing a couple of the wooden slats here. The rope is starting to fray. The bridge sways every time the wind blows. If Sally attempts to cross the bridge, will it support her weight, or will it collapse, leaving her to plunge to her death? She might think that it will hold her, but how can she be certain? Well, scientifically speaking, Sally is never going to be certain. There's always going to be some evidence that suggests the bridge will support her, like the fact that it hasn't fallen down yet, and some evidence that suggests that it will not support her, like the fact that the rope is fraying. And in this situation, science remains uncommitted to either option. Sally, however, has to make a decision. And in making a decision, Sally has to place a form of confidence, a form of conviction, a form of sureness on one side or the other. Either she is going to have hope that the bridge will hold her, in which case she will cross, Or she's going to have despair that the bridge will not hold her, in which case she will not cross. Or maybe it's something different. Maybe she has hope that, that just over the rise she'll find the base camp, in which case she wouldn't need to risk crossing the bridge. But no matter what decision she makes, she has to invest herself in a proposition that, from a scientific standpoint, cannot be fully justified. Thus, in making decisions, we need a kind of confidence, a kind of certainty that science is just not equipped to give us. Now, this kind of certainty can take many different forms: hope or despair, cynicism or faith, but we need confidence in some form. And if we have to have confidence, hope, to me, on balance, seems like a pretty good option. But then we are left with a tension, because if we get hope from some source that's extrinsic to science, how can we maintain it under the lens of scientific skepticism? If we want to maintain our hope, should we then limit our exposure to science? To put it in a sum-up fashion, we like the fact that we can be motivated to study science, but we need something that motivates us to study science and at the same time preserves our ability to hold these certainties like hope or despair, cynicism or faith. And again, I'm going to leave this as a tension, how we actually become motivated to study science and maintain things like hope. And I'm going to move to the third leg of our triangle here. Whoopsie. There we go. The third leg of our triangle, the interaction of hope with suffering. And at this point, I have to announce that we have officially reached the part of the talk where I have no academic expertise. Okay, so I'm a chemist. I don't do any research on the interaction of suffering with hope. And so for this last leg of the triangle, I'm going to have to lean a lot more on personal experience than I can on research and scholarship. I just wanted to give you some fair warning and explain why that's the case. But the first thing that we can do is something that I think is rather important, which is before we talk about how suffering and hope relate to each other, we need to acknowledge that different people have different views about the role of suffering and how it should be dealt with. People can hold any one of several different philosophical views on suffering, and these views fall into at least three different categories. So the first of these categories is the idea that all circumstances that lead to suffering should be fixed if possible. So I think this attitude is the most widespread philosophy in science. And it's the philosophical worldview that guides things like the Humanist Manifesto, and it makes a certain amount of sense. Suffering hurts. We don't like it. So if something causes suffering, we should fix it. In many cases, it is actually this philosophy that pushes people to become scientists. They see in science a means to fix the causes of suffering that they see. Now, within this philosophy, though, hope plays a relatively insignificant part. The only role for hope is as a sort of consolation prize, a sort of backup plan. Hope is useful to us because it helps us bear the burden of suffering for those cases where it is not possible to fix the cause. Hope that our circumstances might eventually change makes any incurable suffering at least a tiny bit more bearable. But on the whole, this philosophy heavily tips the scales against hope and toward science. Now, the second philosophy about suffering is this, the idea that we should rise above all emotional attachments that bring about suffering. Now again here, the premise is the same. The premise is that suffering is unpleasant and should be avoided. However, the mechanism of avoiding suffering here is completely different. Rather than fixing the external causes of suffering, in this case, the external causes are completely ignored. The focus is on the internal causes of suffering. This philosophy recognizes that to some extent suffering is a choice. A particular event need not make me suffer if I choose not to suffer from it. And this is a central idea in many forms of Buddhism, as well as the philosophy of Stoicism. And in this kind of philosophy, science is basically useless here, because science can only address the outward external causes of suffering, sickness, hunger, violence, and not the critical inward causes. However, this philosophy also holds great storehouses of hope, because it implies that the tools to solving my problems with suffering are somehow supposed to exist within me. There's the very real hope that I could free myself from suffering through careful self-analysis. And so here, the scales are heavily tilted away from science, but toward hope. The final philosophy about suffering is that we achieve redemption through suffering. Now here, the premise is fundamentally different. Whereas the first two philosophies presupposed that all suffering was bad and needed to be avoided, here the assumption is that some suffering is not just unavoidable, it is necessary. This rather unusual idea is at the heart of Christianity, and the idea is that maybe most suffering, maybe 99.99% of it, maybe that much suffering is bad and needs to be avoided, but that remaining 0.01% of suffering is important. It is necessary for us to be redeemed. Now, you'll often hear this philosophy misquoted as wisdom through suffering, which is also a nice idea, but quite different than this one, because in most cases when people refer to wisdom through suffering, they are actually advocating for the first philosophical position here, the idea that suffering should be fixed if possible. You see, the idea is that if you are suffering, you probably did something stupid that got you into the situation in the first place. And while you are enduring that suffering, you should reflect on your own stupidity and gain the wisdom to make sure that you don't get in that situation again, thereby fixing the cause of your suffering. The idea of redemption through suffering is much more complex. To begin with, it supposes that there is something wrong with us that needs to be redeemed. Second, it proposes that suffering does more than just teach us a lesson. It proposes that suffering somehow itself fixes the problem. And at this point, I think I need to share a little bit of my own personal story. So I was raised in a Christian home in the United States growing up. And though I was raised in a Christian home, I have to confess that I was a Christian who really adhered to philosophy number one. I really thought that circumstances that lead to suffering should be fixed if possible. And so one of the reasons I was a Christian was because it seemed like God was a good person to have around if you wanted to fix conditions of suffering. You could pray to him and he would make you feel better. You could ask him to fix problems, and occasionally it appeared that he would intervene and fix them for you. It seemed like he was a useful tool for accomplishing the reduction of suffering. So I grew up as a Christian, and then I went away to college. And in college, I struggled with depression. I had struggled with this in high school, but in college, it got significantly worse. I got to where I was having trouble sleeping at night. I was having trouble eating during the day. I had trouble focusing in class. There was one semester where I actually had to drop down to taking just 2 classes, one of which was independent study. And that was as much as I could handle for that semester. Things that I used to enjoy, I didn't enjoy anymore. And when I was in that place, I prayed to God. I prayed that God would fix the causes of my suffering. I prayed earnestly, day after day after day, and nothing happened. And so I went with plan B. If apparently God didn't really have much interest in fixing my suffering, I could turn to science. So I went to a psychiatrist, and I got counseling, and I got medication, and gradually over the course of several weeks, I got better. And so it was pretty clear to me, from my experience, that science worked, God didn't. And so I stopped going to church, I stopped reading the Bible, I stopped praying, because what was the point? And I went on like that for a number of years. I was better, but I wasn't exactly what you might call well, because while the medicine alleviated the symptoms of depression, the medicine could not give me hope. Because as someone who in college had 2 major episodes of depression, I knew that statistically it was 85% likely that I was going to have a 3rd major depressive episode in my life, and I knew there was a 60% chance that I was going to struggle with chronic depression for the rest of my life. I also knew that the medication I was on had decreasing efficacy over time. So the longer you had to take it, the less effective it became. Science didn't give me a lot of reasons to hope. And around this time, I tried out philosophy number 2, the idea that I should rise above the emotional attachments that were causing my suffering. But I could never make it work. You see, there weren't events in my life that caused me to get depressed. It wasn't like I got depressed when my girlfriend dumped me or my grandma died or because I failed a test. I would be going along, things would be going fine, and then all of a sudden, they just wouldn't be going fine. My neurochemistry was screwed up. And no matter how much I tried to rise above my own brain, I was never able to do it. So, some years later, I did return to Christianity, and I just have to say that being a Christian has not healed me of depression, but it has taught me the redemptive value of suffering. It has taught me hope. And to explain why, I need to share another personal story. So, these are two pictures of my son, Peter. And when he was 3 months old, Peter started having some strange health problems. So you can sort of see it here. He started having little, purplish blue spots that were appearing, so some there on his elbow and some on his leg. He also started getting bloody noses. He had a blood vessel burst in his eye, and so we took him to the hospital, and they ran some tests, and they told us the bad news was that Peter had an autoimmune condition. It was known as Evans syndrome. And in Evans syndrome, what happens is that your immune system gets confused, and it thinks that your red blood cells and your platelets are bacteria. And it attacks them, and it kills them. And so Peter was both dangerously anemic, because he had very few red blood cells, and he was also prone to bleed or bruise at the slightest injury. So all of these little purplish red spots are actually little tiny bruises. So that was bad news for us. But the worst news that the doctors had to share was that there is no cure for Evans syndrome. They could treat his symptoms. They could prolong his life. They were confident that they could manage his symptoms, but he would always be sick. And so we prayed. We prayed that God would make him well. But being pragmatists that we are, in the meantime, we started him on immune suppressants. And the immune suppressants worked. His symptoms got better. So here's a picture of him about that time. His immune system is still malfunctioning, but he looks healthy. And then something strange happened. At his next monthly checkup, they ran his blood test, and he passed. Now, I'm a scientist, and so I thought, well, that's only one test. The lab technician might have messed the test up, and plus he's on these strange immune suppressants which could be messing with the result. I'm not convinced. So the doctors weaned him off the medication, and they waited a few months, and they gave him another blood test, and he passed again. And here's a picture of Peter around his first birthday. Here he is at 2, helping to shovel the snow. Here he is at 3, sharing a drink with his dad. It's his 4th birthday party. There he is at 5, a few weeks ago, dressed up in his Easter best. And I show you all these pictures because every year they give him a blood test, and every year he passes. Somehow his immune system got reset. And the doctors, they can't explain it. Peter was sick, we prayed, and he got better. It certainly seems to me like a miracle. And because of things like this, I can have a special kind of hope. Hope that I could not have gotten if I had not suffered. Hope that I could not have attained if I was not emotionally attached to the outcome. You see, Peter being healed, for me, is far better than if he had never been sick at all. Because after all these years, I finally get it. Suffering brings about redemption. Because at the heart of Christianity is a story exactly like my story and exactly like Peter's story. It's a story of a God who came to earth and suffered in the most miserable fashion that you can imagine. Dying alone, hanging on a cross. But through that suffering, not in spite of it, but through it, Jesus wins the most miraculous and unexpected victory, because 3 days later, he rises from the dead. And because of Jesus, we can be redeemed through suffering, both by sharing in his suffering and sharing our suffering with him. And in this process, we gain hope. And so I can say that I am no longer scared of depression. Not that I don't think that it might happen to me, it might, but I'm not scared of it because I have hope. Because God healed my son, God raised Jesus, my suffering is part of his plan for redemption for me. And so now I've shared a bit of my personal story. I want to go back now to some of those hanging questions, those tensions from earlier. And I want to say how I would address these tensions, given now that you know my personal story, you know my worldview, my cards are on the table. How would I answer those tensions? And I don't intend my answers to be authoritative. There are other worldviews you could argue deal with these questions equally well. But I want to review my personal thoughts just as a way of summing up what we've talked about and leading into some question and answer time. So the first thing we said was that we needed a moral framework that was consistent with the practice of science and powerful enough to direct scientific inquiry. Well, from the beginning, Christians believe that that the universe was created by God. So study of that creation is one of the ways that we are encouraged to learn about him. So Christianity is profoundly in favor of scientific study. But at the same time, the same God who created the universe also handed down a moral code. We're given these two gifts from the same creator with the same degree of power and the same degree of majesty, so that Christian ethics can guide science without stifling it. The second thing that we said we needed was we needed something that could motivate us to study science and still maintain hope. Well, for many Christians, the fact that science can teach us about God is a profound motivation for studying science. And in fact, it was the primary motivation of many of the founders of modern science, folks like Isaac Newton and Michael Faraday. But at the same time, because of God's goodness in Christianity, we maintain a sense of hope. Hope that you cannot poke holes in. Finally, Christianity clearly encourages us to help those who are suffering. Whoops, wrong direction. Help those who are suffering. But it recognizes the crucial role that suffering can play in redemption and eternal hope in the person of Jesus. And so I've touched on what I think are some of the key points of tension in this subject, and the solutions I have personally found helpful. And I hope that as I've been speaking, you have been thinking about your own life and how you deal with these issues. And so I very much look forward to our discussion, fielding some questions from you. Thank you very much.
We welcome you to pose a question, and maybe in addition to asking a question, you can also tell us your name and maybe your affiliation. Yes, so please.
My name is Peter Kwong. I obviously have interest in actually different religion. Christianity is one, and Buddhism and others. I myself is an engineer, and I'm working actually now for the finance sector. But my question tonight is, if you go back to your presentation, one of which is the breast cancer using mice and gorillas. So this relates to the ethical question. So basically, I just want to have your view in terms of, using artificial altered genes in corns and beef and other food stuff. I'd like to hear your view on this. Secondly, the questions about Monsanto. I'm sure the audience know about this company very well. Again, I'd like to hear your views on these two accounts. Thank you.
So before you step down, could you review I think this works, so I can do that. You can review for me, so for the second part about Monsanto, if you wanted to review for the audience how Monsanto relates to that question, I think it might help.
Well, Monsanto is a company that specializes in alter genes on many foodstuff, from fruits, vegetables, beef and others. For fruits, basically, you need to buy the seeds because oranges does not produce its own seeds, so you have to. So that creates a monopoly. So this is an ethical question, and I'd like to hear your views on There are actually many lawsuits against Monsanto right now if you go to Google it. So if you can elaborate on your views on it, that would be appreciated. Thank you.
Yeah, well, those are both great and difficult questions. So I certainly agree that in both cases there are significant ethical questions, and the main thing that I've come to the conclusion of is that the very first step to solving ethical questions like this is admitting that there is an ethical question. And I found too many scientists either don't want to admit that there is an ethical question, or maybe that they don't know that there's an ethical question, or they don't want to admit that there is one. But there is. There are significant ethical questions in both cases. As far as the use of genetically modified organisms, I don't see in terms, I mean, obviously I think there are limitations to the types of genetic modifications that might be ethically reasonable. I think the types of genetic modifications that are commonly being used now are similar to what one could get in most cases through crossbreeding, just accelerated in time. And so for the most part, GMOs seem to be ethically viable at this point, but that doesn't mean that there is not still a question there of, well, how much modification is too much modification? For the question of Monsanto, it really gets to a different side of things, not whether genetically modified organisms are ethical or not, but how do we ethically use those things? So Monsanto is deriving great profit from these things because they have, as you said, a monopoly on them because they are not self-propagating. And there are ethical questions that I'd say are really more related to economics and the redistribution of wealth and so forth that are related to that that also need to be asked. And so I don't necessarily think that I have the expertise to weigh in and say, here's the right solution, but I think it's great for us to actually be able to acknowledge in a public forum that there are ethical questions that scientists should be weighing in on here.
Thank you. So we'd like to see more questions lining up, and I think we're seeing one coming out here right now. Thank you. Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Amrita. I'm a Hindu, not a Christian, but I've been very close to Christianity since high school. My question is about hope and suffering, and it might be a bit of a practical question, but there's stages in life where you're suffering, and it's really hard to get that hope back. It's to the extent that there's no room to get hope. So in your story, when you shared about your son, I think it was hard for you to start believing back to God, and you started praying. And there's stages that sometimes you think your prayers are never going to be answered. So what do you do at that point? Like, you're in that stage of depression, and it's hard to get back that hope.
Yes, I completely agree. This is actually why this particular topic resonated so much for me, because for me, depression is very much about being robbed of hope. I mean, there are many other symptoms that go along with it. And so when I say that I have some form of hope, it's not always like, when I'm feeling depressed, it's not necessarily that I have this really warm, bubbling feeling inside and I all of a sudden am able to jump for joy, but it's more of an abiding hope that I can say, well, things may go from bad to worse from here, but I remember in the past one good thing. And so that's or one good thing, or two good things, or three good things that I can hold on to. And while I may not at that point see much hope for the future, there is still an anchor point for me that I hold on to. But it's still a very daunting question of saying, well, how do you get back to the point where that intellectual abiding feeling fills your heart again? And it's still something that I struggle with, so I appreciate the question.
Yes, question there.
I'm an alumni. I have a question related to depression, because I was joining some other lecture. There are some discussion on mindfulness-based stress reduction, and I heard about your experience. Other than praying to God, do you have what is your view on this sort of mindfulness practices in terms of stress reduction or helping depression, and what is your views on the scientific evidence in supporting that?
Yeah, mindfulness is a really interesting subject, and there's a lot of great research going on. A lot of it actually at Harvard Medical School, right across the river from MIT. And I can't say that so there certainly are people much more expert than I am, but my general impression of the subject is that there does seem to be pretty good scientific evidence that practices like mindfulness are actually helpful to us in terms of making progress in terms of, say, chronic pain, for example, and that these types of practices can be useful. I think and certainly I've found that being mindful of the moment that I'm in and the surroundings around me can be helpful to me at times too. Were you interested in more than that, or?
I'm just curious whether you have experience on that and the latest development, because I was reading some of the tech talk, and they seems to be having a lot of new data on this particular area.
Yeah, there is. Yeah, there's a very large. I mean, so there's actually an annual conference on mindfulness at Harvard Medical School. So there's enough of a community of medical researchers that are really taking this data seriously and taking this as a tool that can be useful. So one of the things they're trying to do is they're trying to put this out as something that every doctor should be telling their patients about. So in addition to prescribing medicines and doing procedures and surgeries, they should also be saying, giving information about mindfulness practices that could be helpful. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Another question? Yes.
Hello, how are you doing? My name is Martin from Holland. I'm just curious about some of the reasoning you explained and how they came to fruition. For example, you were very critical, and rightfully so, on the blood test. So maybe it was a human error, maybe someone saw some data, didn't do right at the data, maybe something else happened, something unseen played a role, so you did not a blood test, etc. But then, after the healing of your son, which I'm very happy for that happened, you do take a quantum leap, if I may use those terms, until God healed my son. And where is your critical viewpoint in there, the critical reasoning as a scientist?
Yeah, so I should clarify when I say that, and that's a good point of saying, okay, at what point can you be a scientist and believe something like this? And that's something that I actually, so before this I wouldn't say that there was anything that had happened in my life that I would have used that same term for. Like, I'm pretty skeptical about things. And so what's the difference here? Well, first of all, I want to make sure that everyone here is clear when I say that God healed my son, and my belief is that happened. Obviously, you guys can draw your own conclusions about things. It's not necessarily that I feel that is an adequate scientific explanation for what happened. In other words, I'm not just going to throw up my hand and say, well, there could never possibly be any scientific, justification of what happened. There isn't one. Even if there was some mechanism by which this happened, I would still say that God was the ultimate cause. He may not have been the immediate cause, the one that, when he may not have gone in and fixed things. He may have done it through some genetic or some environmental factor that, indirectly caused him to get better. But still, I can view God as the ultimate cause of what happened there.
There is a sentient being in the front end at the beginning of all those actions that led, be it natural causes, that led to the recovery of your son. There was an intellect, a being at the beginning. Why does it have to be like that? What's your reasoning for that?
Oh yeah, well it doesn't. So so it doesn't have to be like that. So that's, as I said, with something like this, there is incomplete evidence. So this is one of the examples of a case where there is incomplete evidence about what happened. And so we have to make a decision about what we think. We can make a decision that says we think that this is what happened, or we can think that it's something else. But no matter what decision we make about this, it's based on some assumptions beyond the evidence.
Exactly, it's not a hypothesis, it's an assumption, but you do say it with the certainty of a scientist, and I don't know how you could match it.
So that's what I'm saying is I'm not saying this as a scientific thing.
You said pretty certainly, God healed my son, in those
Yes.
words. So
Yes.
it's a bold statement.
I am also certain of other things that I cannot prove perfectly, that are not just scientific observations, but that are
Assumptions.
that are informed by scientific observations, but are not completely justified by them.
They are unfalsifiable as well.
So, I believe that my wife loves me.
I really hope so, and
But I can't say with scientific certainty, I don't have any scientific data other than my experiences that suggest that my wife loves me.
Then why present a lecture around this assumption as a scientist?
Why present?
Well, you gave a few examples, some of which, the depression, you tried prayer, didn't help, you tried medication, did help, but you needed some more prayer or some aura of hope with it to prevent a relapse or anything. You tried literally 2 scientific approaches to depression, counseling and medication there, and there's way more as you might know. But, so their prayer didn't work, and then the case with your son, medication did work in the beginning, but it was a hopeless case. According to the doctors, something else happened, and then that you do ascribe to prayer again, so that now it works all of a sudden. How? I just don't get it.
Well, but I mean, you could say the same thing about medicine, right? So the medicine worked the first time for me when I had depression, but it did not cure my son. It only alleviated his symptoms.
Yeah,
So
the
the science worked in one case and didn't work in the other, but that doesn't mean I say, well, science doesn't work. It just means that I say, well, it worked in one case and didn't work in the other.
Yes, but the certainty with which you say that prayer works. I don't want to keep too much time from this.
Okay, well, I would be happy to chat with you some afterwards.
Definitely.
Absolutely, thank you very much.
Yeah,
Yes,
okay.
indeed. Due to time, maybe we'll take this last gentleman's question. Yeah.
I'm Stanley, and I'm a Christian. Actually, I'm just helping my friend to ask the question. Can you, maybe my question can help you to elaborate more on the hope, because what kind of hope are you really talking about? I mean, temporary hope or eternal hope, or, yeah, for example, because, for example, it just so happened that your example is depression. And the medication for depression is actually really, we cannot really be sure that it's a cure. But for example, for other medical conditions such as infection, the hope for infection, I mean, it's antibiotic, and the hope for it, it's quite absolute. You can really be cured with antibiotics. It just so happens your example is depression, and it's a long-term illness. With that medical conditions and for example infection, I mean, the option one that science can fix things, fix suffering, it's there. So science can give hope in that way. So I mean, and your example of Jesus Christ, how hope can come into this picture.
Okay.
I mean, yeah.
All right. So, Troy?
Yeah, so I agree that I was maybe a little vague on my use of the words hope in different places. So maybe and I think you're right, there is probably something of a difference. So maybe I'll try to, on the fly, unpack that. So you're right that that scientific advances can give us not give us hope, but they can form the basis for hope. So you said, there are some medications where it's really quite likely that they will cure what is wrong with you. We're never going to say that it's 100% that it will cure you, but it's really quite likely. And so in that case, scientific evidence, I would say that although it seems like the scientific evidence gives you the hope, so the scientific evidence has gotten you most of the way to hope, but not all the way to hope. It says, okay, well, it's more reasonable to hope maybe, tips the scales in the favor of hope as opposed to despair, but it doesn't get you all the way there. You always have to invest that little bit of confidence, your own personal confidence, in that scientific data to get all the way to hope. Now, the hope that I spoke about at the end, it may be a little bit different. I mean, there is evidence. So so in the same sense, there's the evidence of the empty tomb, or for me, the evidence that my son got well. These are bits of evidence that point towards some type of a hopeful philosophy. But the hope might be a little bit different than the hope that you would get out of science, because I'm not hopeful for a particular outcome. In other words, I don't know what good thing I'm expecting. It is more of a hope that I hope, I have an expectation that something good is coming. And so it's a little bit different kind of hope than what you would get from having found a medicine that you think will cure you.
But at least in this discussion, I mean, the hope that you're pertaining is confined in the existence here on Earth.
Oh, no, so I mean, so scientific hopes would be confined to existence here on Earth, and then, yes, so the hope in the Christian faith extends beyond that, obviously, as well, yes, yeah.